A few months ago, I walked out to our chicken coop because my boys told me there was a predator prepared to get some of the chickens. And to my surprise, I couldn't find anything until I realized my face was only 3 to 4 inches away from a snake staring me right in the face. What did I do? I grabbed it. That's what you do, right? It had been caught in some netting that I had put on top of the coop to keep birds out. Apparently, the snakes can't get through it either. So I cut the netting, I let it go, and you'd be happy to know it was only a king snake, so there was really no real damage or danger to begin with. But there was a time where a 3.5-foot Timber rattler showed up a month later. And I'll tell you that story at the end of the sermon. But immediately you get the concern. What do snakes do, children? They bite. They what? They bite and they eat. So we avoid them. But the snake bites is not merely as painful as the life of folly, which is the point of our chapter this morning, or chapters. So you live in a world that tells you the only foolish way to live is to believe that there is no foolish way or to believe that there is a foolish way to live. That is, the way of Christianity asserts that there's a moral fabric or moral structure to the universe. We believe that just as there are rebar in these walls, I hope there is, forgive me, construction people, if I'm wrong, but I assume there is. Just as there is rebar in these walls, Christians believe that there is rebar in the moral fabric of the universe. But the masses would tell you to believe that is to be a fool. The masses will bite you if you insist the universe is structured by right and wrong. You by now should have evolved past that assumption in the 21st century. People can live however they want. And I wonder if some of that has crept into our thinking. Even though we're Christians, perhaps we have adopted some of this relativism into what we think a Christian community ought to do and be about. But our passage today, like the concerns for the existence of a rattlesnake in front of you, our passage tells us there is a real and venomous bite in the universe. And it still remains, even though we're in a fallen world. Listen to atheist Friedrich Nietzsche. Listen to what he says, why he hated Christianity. He's going to say specifically that he hates Blaise Pascal, who is a French mathematician and philosopher, Christian, brilliant philosopher. But listen to what he says. This is Nietzsche saying this about Pascal. I'll begin at the beginning of the quote. Christianity has taken the side of everything weak. The most pitiful example is the corruption of Pascal, who believed that his reason was corrupted by sin, when the only thing corrupting it was Christianity itself. I wage war on this theological instinct. I have found traces of it everywhere. Anyone with theologian blood in his veins will approach things with a warped and deceitful attitude. What is it that he views as warping their views, he says? This gives rise to a pathos that calls itself faith, turning a blind eye to yourself once and for all, so that you do not have to stomach the sight of incurable lying. Nietzsche claims, contrary to Hebrews chapter 11, that the life of faith is what bites humankind in the end. It's the ultimate form of self-deception, he says. But like Hebrews 11, the preacher this morning says otherwise. He has shown us throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, the book that the view of living by what we can see alone, he says, is foolish. He's dismantled that. Last week, he exhorted us that instead of living life by what we can see, we should respond with a life that lives by Torah. We saw specifically Genesis 1 and 2 show up in the beginning of Ecclesiastes chapter 9. Instead of living by our sight alone, we should live by what God has said. And the reason for that is because mankind's knowledge is limited. This is an undeniable fact. You see the bite that concerns him down in verse 14? Look at Ecclesiastes 10, verse 14. Here's where he reveals it. He says, a fool multiplies words. He talks his perspective over and over. And the reason that's foolish, he says, is because no man or woman knows what is to be. And who can tell him what will be after him? That's his point. The fool bites himself. That's a foolish way to go Because living by your perspective means living by a perspective that is guaranteed you cannot see or know what comes next. Nietzsche says you're a fool for being skeptical of your self-referencing thought and autonomy. But the preacher this morning says that the fool is the one who thinks that he or she is fit to govern yourself. The fool sets his schedule according to his interests and hobbies alone, not by what God has said is good for him. The fool is the parent who neglects raising their children in the instruction of the Lord, hoping somehow they'll turn out a believer in adulthood. The fool is the child who professes Jesus in their mouth while lying to parents or being cruel to their siblings. The fool makes his peace be whatever political party has the White House. The fool rationalizes his idolatry and wonders why he cannot trust God. The fool keeps his faith to Sunday mornings only and prepares to navigate the rest of the week by his own ordering of things. Like a rattlesnake, the preacher says this morning that the fool's self-referenced approach to life bites in the end. That is, you might as well be eating Tide Pods or drinking bleach. What is the fool? Derek Kidner defines the fool well through the book of Ecclesiastes and Proverbs. And he says, at first glance, we might think the fool seems to mean one who is dull or obstinate, not very smart. But it must always be remembered that the book has in mind a fool is somebody who has a particular chosen outlook rather than mental equipment. The fool has no idea of a patient search for wisdom. He has not the concentration for it. He imagines it can be handed out to him over the counter without much work. So he laps up his opinions unreflectingly. He pours them out freely, unaware that he's only displaying his folly as a trader spreads out his goods. His sage remarks either fall flat or turn around on him. But he will never realize this, for the fool cannot imagine himself mistaken. The root of his trouble is spiritual, not mental. He likes his folly. He has no reverence for truth, preferring comfortable illusions. At bottom, the fool rejects the fear of the Lord. The fool recoils at waiting on God because he believes faith in God will bite you. That's what's sent or sold to us from the culture around you. The preacher says that it's actually the self-referencing, the self-determined will, the self-determined life that bites you in the end. Because at the end of the day, you and I have limited knowledge. We have limited wisdom. So we must consider for a moment. We all here confess to be believers, but there are ways in which folly can even creep into our lives. There are ways in which we can live, even though we've confessed Christ, as if self-reliance is more compelling than what God has said. Think about how we approach getting the gospel out into the community. Do we prepare like 1 Peter says? Every believer should always be prepared to give a defense for what we believe. Or have we relegated evangelism to a few hired hands or programs? When it comes to who we should love in this congregation, have we committed our time and energy to only loving those in our niche portion of the congregation? Or do we submit to the Lord's wisdom that Paul gave us in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, where we realize we need every single brother or sister in this room, young or old? When the Word tells us that wisdom is the greatest wealth that we can give boys and girls in our midst, do we tell ourselves, the Word's too hard for them? They learn grammar, geometry, and chemistry and biology at school, but dare we teach them theology? That's over their head. When the Word instructs us to not neglect meeting together, have we persuaded ourselves that there's no real bites waiting for us if we spend most of our weekends away from the Lord's people? Remember, brothers and sisters, Paul told Timothy to wage the good warfare, holding faith and a good conscience. By rejecting this, some have made a shipwreck of their faith. A believer walking in the way of folly will get bit eventually. And the bite of foolishness, brothers and sisters, is far worse than any rattlesnake. Let me give you a little bit of the context by way of reminder. We're in the final third of the book of Ecclesiastes. And the chief theme that dominates this portion of the book is the repetition that mankind's knowledge is limited. In the first half of the book, we saw that we can't take what's crooked and make it straight. And the second half is going to focus on the fact that you and I have limited understanding. Human knowledge is a bit like driving down Wheeler Road at 7:30 a.m. If you've ever done that, or just whatever time of year you're in, whenever the sun is coming up, you're driving down the road, what you realize is there's a light too bright for your eyes to receive. Life is filled with too much brilliance that if you're going to make it down Wheeler Road during that time, you have to put on a different lens. You need something to translate that light so that your eyes can see it. Brothers and sisters, life is the same way. This enigma is too much for us, and we're going to need wisdom to navigate this life as a result of the fall. 9:13, which we started this morning, all the way to 12:7, are going to commend that wisdom to us. And you might notice that those sections are bracketed by a conversation about death. He wants to prepare us for death, and the way we live in between life and death, or birth and death, is we get wisdom. And this passage is filling us with a positive wisdom, which is a bit of a different approach. Most of this book has been tearing down secularism, but as we saw in chapter 9, verses 7 to 10, the preacher is now reflecting on Torah and commending to us that wisdom is much better than a life of folly. So like Proverbs, you'll notice in our section today, this passage returns to the familiar paths, the life of wisdom and the life of folly. So the question for you and I this morning is, what will we fear more? Will we fear the gravity of the Lord's wisdom in how we make our day-to-day decisions, or will we give a greater weight to what we currently think about things? Will we give a greater weight to our own reasoning apart from this word? Wisdom is the life dependent on God's promises. Folly is the hasty, impatient life that reasons from what it presently knows and can see alone. So today, brothers and sisters, the preacher tells you, if you continue down the life of folly by trusting your reason over God's promises, you'll get bit in the end. You'll get bit in the end. There's a real rattlesnake left in life to bite you, and it is called folly, he says. Now here's the first temptation, verses 13 to 17. The snake-bitten life is the preferred life, verses 13 to 17. The first temptation for you and I is that the snake-bitten life is on demand, verses 13 to 17. He says, I have also seen this example of wisdom under the sun, that is how wisdom gets treated, and it seemed great to me. There was a little, that's great as in not positive, but a major thing. This is a big deal, verse 14. There was a little city with few men in it, and a great king came against it and besieged it, building great siege works against it. But there was found in it a poor wise man, and he by his wisdom delivered the city, yet no one remembered that poor wise man. But I say to you, wisdom is better than might, though the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heard. The words of the wise heard in quiet are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. He opens this section with this point. Folly is popular. The way of folly, everyone seems to enjoy. The snake-bitten life is what's on demand in the world around you. 13 to 15 tell the sad story of a small town threatened by a king and his great army. The good news is they had a poor wise man, a man who could deliver them. That is verse 16, this poor wise man is stronger than might. That is, they have a way out. Verse 15, I think the NET, the New English Translation, gets it right. It's saying that he could have delivered them, which I think makes sense of the context. Because the end of verse 15, the tragedy is that the city did not remember they had this poor wise man when the battle came. Despite the profitability of his wisdom, we're told at the end of verse 16 what? The poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heard. Nobody heard when they needed his wisdom. And the point comes to you and I in verse 17. The point is, it is better to be forgotten along with this wise man than to join the folly of the masses. It is better to be wise and alone than to be accepted by the nations and be a total fool. That is, brothers and sisters, if you want to follow Christ, if you want to be a Christian, you are not going to get red carpet treatment. Most people love and celebrate the snake-bitten life because in the moment, it's a thrill. The Torah reflects a life of wisdom that people despise. People don't generally want to hear what God has said. Human culture gravitates around rebellion to what the Word has said. Therefore, the masses, you'll see in verse 17, celebrate the folly of the ruler. In church, we must remember that in the last days that we're in now, we're told it'll happen among us as well, right? Paul says in 2 Timothy, understand this, in the last days there will come times of difficulty, for people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having the appearance of godliness, but denying its power. Avoid such people. One of my favorite things about Hilton Head is there's a canal near where we stay, and all the time, whenever we go there, I love to make at least one trip walking over to it because there you see alligators. And what do they put in front of bodies of water that have alligators? Don't feed them. And so what does everyone do? Feed them. That's what we do. And the preacher is saying, brothers and sisters, you live in a world where people love to feed the alligators. If you want to fit in, you're going to, by necessity, be joining them as they feed the alligators. Don't be shocked when you get bit. Prize the gift of a small community of people who count the word of the Lord greater riches than anything else you could find. You aren't guaranteed to have this many people in a room who want the word together. What a mark of the Lord's grace. This is rare. This is rebellion against Satan. Cherish the fact that there are people in this room with you who in quiet would rather the word of the Lord than the folly that governs the world today. What a gift from the Lord. The snake-bitten life is popular, but how sweet it is when you find a group of people where wisdom that is unpopular is cherished. Give thanks to the Lord for this congregation. Secondly, though, not only is the snake-bitten life popular, it's very potent. Look at chapter 9, verse 18 to 10, verse 1. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. Dead flies make the perfumer's ointment give a stench. So, a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. Some of you know that last year I did a little bit of teaching at a local private school, and in my brilliance, I thought I'll wear a white shirt on the way to my first day, and in wisdom, I stopped to get coffee. And the first sip that I went to take, I, of course, missed my mouth completely, and, of course, had a nice big brown stain on the front. The reality is, though, my shirt had far more white surface area, way more white on the shirt than coffee. What did everyone notice? The coffee. That's what he's saying happens with folly. It doesn't matter how much energy you put into building with wisdom and virtue. Those things take hard work. It only takes a little ketchup on the shirt to ruin the whole shirt. It only takes a little bit of folly to ruin the work of grace that many are attempting to build. That's his point. One sinner destroys much good. Small flies ruin a large batch of expensive perfume. Making perfume is neither easy nor cheap, and despite having a much larger batch of liquid of perfume, it only takes a few dead flies in the midst to ruin the whole thing. That's what it's like with the foolish life. The fool is effective. He makes an impact. Wisdom is long-suffering. It builds over the long term, but it's hard to build such a culture of wisdom and grace. It only takes one fool to destroy what wisdom does. Maybe an example, you just think about the gift of having this new carpet in here this morning. You think about the amount of hours that have gone in behind the committee that planned it, and the deacons and the volunteers that have sacrificed so much time away from their family to make this beautiful restoration take place. But you know how you ruin it really easily? It takes one fool to love their opinion and complain. Folly can spoil hours of love and sacrifice. It's a fact of life. Folly is far more potent than wisdom. It takes one act of folly in our own lives to ruin a reputation of righteousness. Beware of the bite of folly. It is not only popular, it is potent. It does great damage. But beware, because folly not only is effective, it isn't subtle either. Everyone can see it. Look down at chapter 10, verses 2 to 4. Folly is public. A wise man's heart inclines him to the right, but a fool's heart to the left. Even when the fool walks on the road, he lacks sense, and he says to everyone he's a fool. If the anger of the ruler is against you, do not leave your place, for calmness will lay great offense to rest. You have here the Hebrew emphasis on right and left, right? In the ancient world, the right was the side of strength and wisdom. The left was despised. And so you see the point that he's making there is that wisdom and folly can't go together. They're incompatible. This was the point Paul's making in 1 Corinthians 11. When he's talking about the church, they're a divided church, and they're coming together for the Lord's Supper. And he says, those who want to build the congregation in Corinth based on human eloquence and talent can't possibly get along with those who want to use the gospel, because those aren't bedfellows. They're antithetical. Unity between the foolish way of life and the wisdom of God don't mesh. They have to repel. But the thing is, in verse 3, everyone else can see it, right? See what the fool can't realize? That even the fool walks on the road, he lacks sense, and he says to everyone he's a fool. He isn't declaring himself a fool. It's just saying everyone can tell. Everyone can tell by what they value. Everyone can tell by the decisions that you make. Everybody can see over a period of time who is the fool. You can see someone who's reckless with their finances. You can see someone who has no self-control on social media. You can see people pleasers who smile and flatter but have not the love or grace to speak plainly and truthfully. You can see through the liar who believes they have fooled everyone. Kids, think of those billboards when you're driving down the road, you're in the back seat while your parents are driving. What do you notice? You see those tall poles with giant billboards there, advertisements. What he's saying is if you go down the road of folly, your sin is just like those advertisements. It's public for all to see. You might have tricked yourself into thinking you've gotten away with it, but you're the only fool who hasn't realized your life is on display before everyone. In verse 4, it shows up rather unexpectedly. The fool is most exposed in those sweet moments of resigning from your job. In this case, it's a political ruler, but perhaps the parallel is our boss at work. The fool resigns quickly. You know that feeling of just sticking it to the boss you've hated for years, you've daydreamed about just going in one day, you know what, I quit. Oh, what a joy it is to go in there and stick it to the man. But the preacher says, most of the time, resigning so quickly is a rather foolish thing. He's saying, is there no reflection on your life before God? The circumstances of things, the rulers that happen to be over you? Do you have no patient wisdom to trust God's providence and think that there's a higher order governing things? Do you only operate by what you can see and feel? The person who resigns in a huff ironically demonstrates themselves to be the very fool they're huffing against. Derek Kidner says it this way: while it feels magnificent to resign your post, ostensibly on principle, but actually in a fit of pride, it is in fact less impressive, more immature than it feels. Everyone can see it, except for the person in the huff. So let us reflect for a moment. I think this calls us to reflect on the reputations we have garnered for ourselves. And brothers and sisters, one of the gifts of being a church is that we together can say to one another, what sort of reputation do I have? What sort of characteristics mark my life? It's a beautiful thing to have a brother or sister say, well, in reality, everyone can see this about you. That's an act of mercy, because then we can say, but you know what? Christ is enough for you. Have we cultivated relationships here where we can say to one another, what is my reputation? Am I the fool in public, or have I made a life of wisdom? Another concern with the snake-bitten life is it has power to create an anti-culture. The decisions of the fool produce an anti-culture, he says in verses 5 to 7. See it there? There's an evil that I have seen under the sun, as it were an error proceeding from the ruler. Folly is set in many high places, and the rich sit in a low place. I've seen slaves on horses and princes walking on the ground like slaves. In the ancient world, the ruler made appointments throughout the land. That's the connection between verses 5 and 6. So it was considered wisdom to put those of great culture and experience and wealth into power, because they would have the capacity to reason from their experience and judge the land. But verse 5 says there is a sad scenario when the person in charge is a fool. And that scenario is because in verses 6 to 7, his appointments turned the world upside down. 6 to 7 are saying that the appointment of the fool in power has caused a reversal of the ordinary and right. He's not here making ethical statements about the morality of the rich over the poor or the slave over the prince. He's simply making the point that what was considered ordered in the ancient world, if you put a fool in power, gets flipped, because a fool has consequences. He creates an anti-culture, and he destroys the culture beneath him. He's making the point that a fool in power creates a culture of reversal. That is, you might think practically, if we put a corrupt officer in the public, well, the innocent get abused. When officials are governed by the fear of men, don't be surprised that biological men begin to dominate women's sports and take their scholarships. You put a corrupt official in office, don't be surprised when laws come out that are partial to minority or against minorities. You put that's not a woke point, by the way. That's a point throughout Scripture. In the Old Testament, one of the biggest problems with those in power is that they would work laws that did not benefit those that needed defending. Instead, it continued to strengthen the powerful. You put corrupt leaders over a church, legalism and partiality props up the creatives and big personalities, while the weak and the orphaned and the kids get shuffled aside. The point that he's making, brothers and sisters, is folly is no small error. Not only is it public, but it creates an anti-culture. It destroys culture, and it harms people. It has major communal ramifications, and it destroys a culture of grace. The worst part about this is that the snake-bitten life is really deceptive. It overpromises and underdelivers. Look at verses 8 to 11. He who digs a pit will fall into it, and a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. He who quarries stones is hurt by them, and he who splits logs is endangered by them. If the iron is blunt and one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength. But wisdom helps one to succeed. If the serpent bites before it is charmed, there is no advantage to the charmer. The problem here with the fool is that he reasons by what he can see. Quote, here's what brings the crowds, right? That's how he reasons. Do what brings people. Do that. Here's what drives them away. Don't do that, he says. He reasons at first glance, because what's happening in verses 8 to 11 is you get 6 examples of outward progress. Those are 6 pictures that appear very strong and productive. Digging the hole, breaking through a wall, quarrying stone, splitting wood, taming serpents, which I don't think anyone here does today. But you have these 6 illustrations that are demonstrably, powerfully influential acts. And all of these activities epitomize productivity, that all, however, it takes is a little bit of wisdom to realize that each of those activities comes with major recoil. See, the fool says just go all in. Go head on and do those things. But if you have an ounce of wisdom in you, you look back and you realize, wait a minute, every single one of those activities comes with a painful recoil. The pit digger trips. The construction worker loses a limb due to snake bite. The stone crusher is concussed by flying rocks. The log splitter is stabbed by splintered wood. The lumberjack is exhausted by hasty swinging. The snake charmer is killed prematurely. All of these demonstrate in the practical spheres of life why wisdom, reflection, and ultimately letting God's word rule us is necessary. What appears to be most effective to our eyes in the moment, it comes with great and hidden and devastating costs long term if you ignore this. The preacher says the wise get this. The wise understands there's more than meets the eye. The wise does not evaluate things based on what he can see alone. He withholds his judgment. He thinks of the bigger picture. He looks to the Lord. What is the Lord doing? The wise does not count his chickens before they hatch. That social media post that feels effective in the end brings no change. It only persuades everyone that they don't like you. That new car purchase feels and smells so good in the moment until a few months later you realize you just signed your life away to making that payment for many years to come. Those hormone-stopping pills persuade young children they can change their sex, and yet in adulthood they realize it's created irreversible damage. The activity that makes your child seem more interested in God in the moment, suddenly in adulthood you realize God never had their heart. They were just entertained. Their boredom with God never went away. That music that quickly draws a crowd to church, suddenly you realize that crowd was attached to the music, not compelled to follow their king. Brothers and sisters, there's a way in life that promises results. But in the end, the preacher tells us there's hidden recoil. The wise do not assume that every good idea in the name of the Lord is the Lord's idea. They give thought to what God has said. They let his word guide their decisions. Their eyes aren't on the masses. Their eyes aren't on what brings commotion. Their eyes aren't on the budget. Their eyes aren't on what's easiest. Their eyes are on the word of the Lord. What promises has God made? I want to trust those. Because in the end, they know, verses 12 to 15, that folly is painful. Folly's bite is far worse than any loneliness you might experience from trusting God's word. There is a cost to looking to the Lord's word for wisdom, but the wise know that that loneliness, though painful, is nothing comparable to the bite of folly. Verses 12 to 15. The words of a wise man's mouth win him favor, but the lips of a fool consume him. The beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness, and the end of his talk is evil madness. A fool multiplies words, though no man knows what is to be. And who can tell him what will be after him? The toil of a fool wearies him, for he does not know the way to the city. Verse 12 makes the comparison. There are words that come out of the wise, out of their mouth. There are words that come out of the mouth of the fool. But it's not saying, verse 12, you might be tempted to read that as, if I speak grace, I will win friends and influence people. Is that how it goes? How to win friends and influence people, I think, yeah. The temptation is to read the verse that way. It's not telling you that you're going to get a bunch of friends because you're wise. Otherwise, Jesus failed, right? What it's saying there is the words of the wise bring favor. They produce building up, is what it's saying. That word favor means they produce flourishing. That flourishing may be hard to hear. The point is the words of the wise bring instructive wisdom that benefits and profits and ultimately helps the listeners succeed. And we know that it's saying it's not going to make him popular because he just told us at the end of chapter 9 that there are many who will not hear wisdom. The point is that the words of the wise build something. Whereas the fool, verse 13, from beginning to end speaks from a polluted pond. His words destroy. That's why Paul says in Ephesians 4, the loving church is the one that's equipped to pass gospel words to one another. The fool, however, has nothing to say because, verse 14, he is only confident from his particular perspective. He makes guarantees he cannot secure. He makes promises he cannot keep. And the irony in all of his confidence is he has no clue what's going to happen next. Therefore, verse 15, what is the fool's life like? He's always running from one breeze of wind to the next. Whatever direction the wind goes, the ideas of men, the creativities promoted by church leadership or wherever else, there he must walk. He's not anchored by what God has said. He's chasing the next quick fix. He's chasing the next theological fad, the next attraction, the next money-making scheme. At the end of the day, he's exhausted. And so the words that he speaks crush you. They crush you for two reasons. Number one, either they offer you an idol instead of Jesus who builds, or he's measuring you by his idol, which is expectations you can't ever keep. The fool's speech crushes because it leaves you or some other idol at the center, and you cannot replace Christ, and therefore at some point you'll disappoint. And so his words can never build you up. Some of you know people you've talked to that way. They have no interest in offering Jesus to you, only their ideas, and they exhaust you. See, listening to the fool is like somebody drowning telling you how to learn to swim. He drowns because he's celebrating in all the wrong ways, and his foolish wisdom does you no good. That is to say, the snake-bitten life is the naive life. That means to never grow out of our childhood folly. You see it there at the very end, 16 to 20. Here's folly's party at the end. Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child, and your prince feasts in the morning. Happy are you, O land, when your king is the son of the nobility, and your princes feast at the proper time, for strength and not for drunkenness. Through sloth the roof sinks in, through indolence the house leaks. Bread is made for laughter. Wine gladdens life, and money answers everything. Even in your thoughts, do not curse the king, nor in your bedroom curse the rich, for a bird of the air will carry your voice, or some winged creature tell the matter. He concludes this section of Proverbs by reflecting on the folly when that leader's in power, particularly in the case of when your ruler is a child. In the ancient world, they knew in Hebrew wisdom literature that built up in the heart of a child is folly, right? That's what Proverbs 22 tells us. I think it's verse 15. Proverbs 22, verse 15, folly is stored up in the heart of a child, which means it's a terrible tragedy when the king over the land is very, very young. A childlike king, he says in verse 16, feasts in the morning. Verse 17, he feasts for the wrong reason. He starts his day by getting drunk. He doesn't eat to build and to govern well. He parties early to enjoy the power he's been given. He abuses the role that he has for his own ends and entertainment. Such is the heart of the fool. The kingdom and the home suffer, verse 18, because his laziness produces neglect of hidden dangers. In this case, it's a slow creep that corrupts or breaks the integrity of a roof. He also makes the mistake in verse 19 of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Because people can abuse bread, they can abuse wine, and they can abuse money, he throws them all out. Since bad things will happen, we shouldn't have those things. He goes too far overboard. But the preacher reminds us, no, the problem isn't the bread, the problem isn't the wine, and the problem isn't money. There's still a purpose for those things. But the fool can't make that distinction. He sees a problem, and he assumes that the tool is the problem, not the heart behind it. And he closes verse 20 with this good news. Brothers and sisters, we don't have to be king to be filled with wisdom. As chapter 9, verse 17 tells us, the wise are more powerful than the king. If you heed wisdom instead of the masses of folly and their foolish heroes. Brothers and sisters, because of the hope of Christ, you and I no longer have to walk as fools in the world as we once did. There is now a king who speaks wisely, and his word resonates with your heart. I said at the beginning of the sermon that there was another snake. I held the king snake. I released it back into the woods with no problem, but a month later, a timber rattler came running across the yard. I wasn't there, so there's not much of a story. However, my wife ran over it with the van like a boss, and she killed it. cut off its head. It's awesome. 2 comments in closing. Brothers and sisters, there is a real serpent in the world still. There is really one after you who wants to bite you. 1 Peter 5, your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. But church, what is our hope? What happened on the cross according to Genesis 3:15? Christ crushed the head of the snake once and for all. He put him to shame. He no longer has power over you, Hebrews 1 says. He's already destroyed the works of him who held you enslaved by the fear of death. Brothers and sisters, you have a king who rules you with his wisdom. Jesus is a good king this morning, and we're here because when we hear this book, we hear our king's wisdom. So church, I commend to you, when the world sees you and I, they should see a different light, a different wisdom, because you and I are governed by a different king, a perfect king, a patient king, a long-suffering and wise king. My hope and prayer for us is that we be governed by his wisdom. That's our privilege as Christians.